We don't need to order those stinking seatbelt mounts. We can just make them. MG Rob back with you. And today we're working on the 60 MGA again. This time we're talking about seatbelts. Let's get going. So since this car is now going to get sold, instead of setting up the seatbelts exactly the way they were done by the owner, we're going to set them up more like the factory did. Because the owner had actually just bolted through, had just run through here, bolted it down like that, and put a big washer underneath. And it's not really going through any metal like that. And he was okay with that, with him driving it. But now that we're selling it on, we should do something better. So what I'm going to basically do is copy the way MG did it from the factory. They had originally put seatbelt mountings in here. Now, like Clark Spares sells a kit for that, and I think someone else does too. And based on their dimensions, I'm going to be making some pieces to put into here. So I started playing around with ideas of how to mount these seat belts, and I looked at how the factory did them and the kit that Clark Spares sells, and I figured that I could pretty much duplicate that and have it done today and be able to move on to the rest of the interior. So I played with proof of concept, played with some lighter gauge stuff here, and then moved on to some heavier stuff. And then seeing that this part here was a little too big to actually mount things, I ended up with this. So based on their instructions, you cut a 2-inch hole in the side of the transmission tunnel. So this is about 2 inches here, which would fit right through that hole. And then we can put a nut on the back side of there, and it would end up being pretty much flush on the inside of the transmission tunnel, which is exactly what we want because there isn't that much room in there for the drive shaft and everything. So now how I come up with this blank size was pretty simple. I've got some of these things laying around, which were actually blanks for some parts we used to make over at the shop that I used to work at. And I just took that and said, well, if I just cut it into 4 pieces, it looks like about the right size. So that's how I ended up with the size. So then what I did was I just marked this out into 4 pieces and then did diagonal on all 4 of them so I could find the center. Made a little center punch line here and then scribed a circle about 1 inch in diameter, and this is my setup. So now I just need to cut this thing into 4 pieces, and that'll make me 4 of these little brackets. So the way I come up with doing this is I found this within some of the stuff that I brought home from when the shop I used to work at closed down. This is 3/8 of an inch thick, and the hole size is about 1 and 15/16, 2 inches. So that should work really well. So what I decided, how I went going about doing this, is I take this down to where it's just touching here, and that it's lined up really well with this. Then I move this so that it is centered up. And that sets this in the center of that. And then this is where my little 1-inch circle comes in handy. Because I got this socket measures in 1 inch in diameter. So get this down to where it's pretty close to touching, and I'm just going to kind of make it feel like it's right in the center. And then line that up so that it's in, so that the center of that circle lines up with where that is at. Now this tends to want to pull a little bit. It's not going to be perfectly centered, but now we start pushing it down in there. Now once this thing starts to curl up a little bit, then we can see some curling here where we stop. And I beat this thing back down flat. And then we go a little further. Once we see that starting to curl again, beat it down flat. And then just keep going and doing that over and over again. And once it feels like it's not moving down any further, it's bottomed out. We don't want to keep pressing on it and put any real marks into it. We'll let this thing back up. And we got the basics here. Now we can take this over to the workbench and flatten it out a little bit. Now you can work this over the edge of pretty much anything you want. Since this table has a nice big piece of angle iron on the side of it, I'm just going to use that. And then flip it over because it's going to be not quite flat, and flatten it out. And then there we have one piece. All I got to do is do that to another one, and then we can start working on actually putting them in the car. So now I went ahead and drilled a hole in here. These are 7/16 bolts that go through the seat belt. That's pretty standard. So I drilled a 1/2 inch hole in the middle there, and then we welded on the 7/16 nut here, so that it was centered up here, and trying to tap through it just to make sure, because threads tend to warp a little bit when you weld nuts. So now these need to go in here. Now according to like the instructions, once again, in like Clark Spares, which copies the factory, you got to mark this up like 2 inches up, and I think it was 2 1/4 forward, but I'll double check that real quick before I mark it. And then we drill it out with a 2-inch hole saw. So we're just basically just copying that. So after double checking my measurements, it is 2 inches up, but it's actually 2 1/8 from the back here forward. Now that's off the plane 2 inches high. So if you're measuring from this bottom corner, it's something more like an 1 11/16 up. So I've already got my pilot here. And now I got to cut it with a hole saw. Now these dimensions, those drawings that all that comes from, is from the factory drawings. That's where Clark Spares and them are referencing all this information from. So when you buy the kits, these are round, and they actually tell you go ahead and drill 8 holes evenly spaced around it, and you can put number 10 screws through there, or plug weld them in that pattern. Plug welding, of course, is the better way to do it, but the screws are an acceptable way to do it. Now, since I got these square plates, I just put it in there to where it's going to miss the drain thing there, and I put it here, and then just made up some hole pattern, drilled some holes, and I'll just plug weld them in. Before I plug weld it in, I'll go ahead and hit it with some weld through primer. and then we'll weld it all in there, and then we'll paint it all up and then repeat on the other side. So that's the basic installation of the inside brackets for the seat belts. Now this car, sometime before I ever got to it, had already had nuts welded in here, and actually nuts welded in back here to support 3-port harnesses. But it just never had anything done in the middle here that was actually as good as this was. So now we've got something that's much better, and we can feel a lot better about this moving on to somebody else who didn't make that decision to just say, ah, heck with it, that's good enough, you know? So until next time, this is MG Rob.